Whenever staff gives us, okay, I think we are live. So welcome everybody to the joint budget hearing from the Senate Budget and Taxation Subcommittee on Education and Business Administration, where we're joined by the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Public Safety Administration, subcommittee that I used to serve on along with Chairman Gazzoni, but welcome Chair Haynes and Vice Chair Proctor. Before we start, Chairman Haynes, is there anything you wanted to add before we get started with the budget briefing?
None, not really, other than the full subcommittee of Public Safety Administration, your one-time old committee is fully present and accounted for, and we're ready to proceed whenever you are.
Okay, well, with that, we'll start off with the Executive Department of the Governor. We're going to start with hearing the analysis first from Steve McCullough, and then we'll hear from the Governor's office. Mr. McCullough.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Remind people, I'm sorry, Mr. McCullough, I just wanted to just a bit of housekeeping. Just remind everyone, if they have a question, please utilize the reactions tab on the bottom of your Zoom link and just use the raise hand feature, and both Chair Haynes and I will recognize you. Mr. McCullough, please.
Okay, I am sharing my screen. You should see the Executive Department of the Governor. Is everybody there?
Yes, we see it.
Okay, so the fiscal 22 allowance for the Governor's office decreases by $152,000 or 1.6% compared to the current year working appropriation. Here's just basic overview of how the spending occurs in the Governor's offices, and you can see that the vast majority of the budget is covers the personnel for the Governor and the Lieutenant Governor, with the expenses to run Government House and the offices making up the rest of the budget. As I indicated, the budget overall changes by $152,000 decrease. Personnel accounts for $131,000 of that decrease, and the remaining $21,000 is a decrease throughout the rest of the objects that you see at the bottom of the chart. These are all just general cost containment efforts in this era where state revenues are down. Looking at personnel, the office in the allowance does lose one position. There was a unit of the Governor's office for Performance Improvement, that was transferred to the Department of Budget and Management, and one position went with that unit. There are no issues, and the recommendation is to concur with the Governor's allowance. And that concludes my presentation, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much for that thorough and quick analysis. Thank you. Are there any questions from either subcommittee? I don't see any on my end. Chairman Haynes, do you see any on your end? Okay.
I don't see any from the House Subcommittee, Mr. Chair.
Great. Okay, so we'll move on to the administration. We're joined today by Amelia Alcivar, the Chief of Staff to the Governor, as well as Ms. Mona Vaidya, Director of Financial Administration for the Office of the Governor. Ms. Alcivar, please, welcome.
Thank you so much, and sorry for the slight technical difficulties on our end. We just had to move from our TV to our laptop, so thank you for bearing with us, and thank you very much for the introduction and the analysis. I know you all have our written testimony in front of you, so I won't painstakingly go through it. I did want to say I hope everyone's staying warm and safe in the winter weather today, and thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committees as you review our proposed budget. I want to give a special thank you to our analyst, Mr. Stephen McCullough, for his thorough review. We're pleased to note that he has come to the same conclusion that we have, that this is a responsible and well thought out budget that reflects the Governor's strong belief that it's important for our spending plan to reflect the same fiscal restraint that we're asking collectively of state agencies and entities across government in this extraordinary time. I was pleased to see that the recommended actions are to concur with the Governor's allowance. We respectfully support this recommendation. And once again, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be here today. We are happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions for the Chief of Staff? I don't see any on my end. Chairman Haynes, do you see any on your end?
I do not see any from the House Subcommittee, Mr. Chairman.
The only thing I'd say, Madam Chief of Staff, is earlier today, the Montgomery County Senators forwarded you a letter from the Montgomery County Council just with some questions. So when you get a chance, if you can, you and Secretary Schrader can take a look at it and answer it, would be greatly appreciated.
Thank you, Senator Zucker. We did receive the letter, and I know that the Secretary is going to be getting back to you very shortly. So I will make sure that that happens.
No problem. Well, thank you very much. I don't see any other questions or comments, so thank you very much. I'll now turn it over to Chairman Haynes to go to the next budget analysis. Chairman Haynes.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. If the subcommittees will now turn to the budget of the state treasurer.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Madam Quist to provide the analysis. And if you choose to share your screen, please let our staff know that so that can be, the appropriate steps can be made to make that happen. And you may begin when you're ready.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Samuel Quist. I'll be presenting the analysis for the State Treasurer's Office. I just shared my screen, so I believe you should all be able to see that. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay. All right, good. So I will begin my presentation on the first page of the document. So the fiscal 22 allowance for the State Treasurer's Office increases by 3.5 million or 6.7% to a total of 56.1 million. As you can see on this chart, the majority of the budget is made up of reimbursable funds. These are payments from other state agencies for insurance coverage costs for the state insurance program. Moving on to the next chart, this shows a breakdown of the fiscal 22 allowance. And as you can see, the state insurance program makes up the majority of the budget at about 73% or 40.8 million. The remainder of the budget is the other operating expenses for the State Treasurer's Office. Personnel expenses are about 12%, and then the operating expenses for the Treasury Management Division and the Insurance Management Division are 8% and 4% respectively. The other item on here is bond sale expenses. The cost for issuing general obligation bonds is about 3%. On Exhibit 2, this shows details about the changes in the 22 allowance. So the largest operating change is the increase in insurance coverage. A little over $2 million is the cost insurance for insurance premiums in fiscal 22. There are also the second largest increase is for software programming and licensing costs. These are related to the agency's major IT development project, which concluded funding in fiscal 21. That was the last year that funding for that project was included in the budget. However, in 22, the costs for continuing to implement and maintain that new IT system are shifted to the operating divisions of the agency, and they increase by about 1.1 million for programming costs and 300,000 for licensing costs for continuing to implement that new IT system that they've been working on developing. On the personnel side, there is about $200,000 in total increase in personnel expenses. The largest listed here is $128,000 for turnover adjustments. I would note this is actually due to the Board of Public Works, to the State Treasurer's budget that were taken in July. They had decreased personnel expenses by about $128,000. So this increase seen here is mainly adding that back in to make the expenses the same as what was in the previous year's allowance in 21. And then there are also some other changes for annual salary review and the cost of the 2% salary increase. And these are mostly offset by a few other adjustments. I will move to the key observations section. So on Exhibit 3, we have some more data about the state insurance program. This chart shows the number of new claims processed, the number of claims closed, and the number of pending open complaints each year. As you can see, they all three categories decline in fiscal 2020. These numbers can fluctuate from year to year pending a variety of causes, whether there's happened to be severe weather events throughout the year that cause claims, whether there are other instances where there's causes for the state to be held liable for damages. But these categories did all decline in fiscal 2020. And then, as I noted previously, the costs for insurance coverage to the state have increased by about $2 million in the 22 allowance. These costs in previous years, last year, they also increased. And the Treasurer's Office has noted that these costs have continued to increase in previous years for a variety of factors. Mainly the insurance market as a whole has hardened in previous years, and costs across the board, not just for the state of Maryland, but for insurance coverage in general, is increasing due to the cost to underwrite certain factors, and especially with the state's large total portfolio of assets to be covered. That's certainly the case for the state of Maryland as well. The next key observation that we have in the document, Exhibit 4, this compares the return on the state's investment portfolio. The blue line is the state's investment portfolio. The red line is the average 90-day Treasury bill rate, which is included as a comparison. So you can see in previous years, the state's investment portfolio had slightly outperformed the Treasury bill rate up until about 2019. Due to the strength of the economy at that point during fiscal 2019, the Federal Reserve and the federal funds rate had actually increased through about the end of 2019, where it reached its peak. And then in 2020, once we saw the pandemic start in March of 2020 and the economic uncertainty surrounding that, the federal funds rate was decreased very low starting in March and April. And because of that, we've seen some declines in the return on the state's investment portfolio in fiscal 20. This data only goes through the end of 2020 and averages 2020, but in 2021, those rates have continued to stay fairly low and are projected to maintain that level throughout fiscal 2020, as long as there's still economic uncertainty. The other chart included here, Exhibit 5, is the Maryland Local Government Investment Pool Fund balance. This fund saw some increases over 2020 to about $8.9 billion. And I thought this was interesting. The Treasurer's Office noted that a reason behind this is also related to the economic uncertainty surrounding the pandemic, and local governments in general have had more cash on hand that they've needed a place to put for the short term. Part of this is due to the economic uncertainty. Local governments have needed to maintain cash on hand to pay for unexpected expenses that they may face rather than have it in more long-term investments. And then another reason was that because the local government units had funds previously in longer-term investments, some of these investments were called early prior to their maturity dates in 2021 once the pandemic emerged. And this caused that cash to be returned to the local government units, and they needed a place to put that money, at least temporarily. So they increased investments in the local government investment pool. Moving to the recommended actions page. So DLS is recommending to concur with the governor's allowance, and we do not have any further recommendations. The last item in the analysis document, we have a brief update on the depository banking conversion process that the state treasurer has been undergoing in the past year or so. This was reaching its conclusion last spring, and it was anticipated that it would be concluded last spring. However, due to the pandemic, there were some delays with putting the final steps in place, and the treasurer's office has advised that where they are currently is that most of this process has been completed at this time. However, there are still some final steps related to closing the remaining incumbent bank accounts from the previous contract and implementing some of the final contracts surrounding that for some of the state agencies that have more complex banking needs to finalize those last steps. But this is projected to be completed in the next few months. So that is all that I have in the presentation, and I would be happy to take any questions at this time.
Okay. Are there any questions for our budget analyst, Mr. Quist from PSA? I see Vice Chair Proctor. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know if this is actually a question. I just wanted to make this statement. I would be concerned that we are transitioning into Wells Fargo when they have had so many claims against them. Their diversity is very questionable at best. So I just want to go on record as saying that. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. I do know that the state treasurer is set to testify as well. So, Madam Vice Chair, you may want to also bring that concern to the treasurer's attention as well. Are there any other questions from the members of the Public Safety and Administration Subcommittee? I don't see any. However, Sam, Mr. Quist, I do have one question. Maybe you can briefly answer it. If not, maybe I can save it for the state treasurer follow-up. My understanding is that the state does have, on the insurance issues, the state is mostly self-insured, but also has some private coverage by which premiums are paid, and that seems to be a particular driver of the increased costs on the insurance. Do we know offhand what percentage of our insurance coverage is self-pay, self-insured versus private? And if not, I can maybe ask the state treasurer or ask for some follow-up on it, but just offhand, would you know that?
I don't have the exact percentage breakdown in front of me. I believe the majority of it is self-insurance, and it's less than that for private insurance, but I would have to defer to the treasurer to answer that question.
All right. Okay, seeing no further questions from anyone, thank you very much, Mr. Quist. We will now call up our state treasurer, Treasurer Kopp, and we also have with her, let me just bring it up here, the Honorable Nancy Kopp, State Treasurer, and Ms. Bernadette Blahnik, Chief Deputy Treasurer of Maryland. Welcome, and you may go ahead and begin when you're ready. And if you have anything to share with the members on screen-wise, just please let our staff know and they will make the appropriate accommodations for you. Thank you very much. Treasurer Kopp, you may begin when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Good to be back with all of you. You do have my testimony, I believe, in writing or in whatever format we were told to deliver it in.
Okay.
And I do want to start out, as I have for a number of years thanking the Department of Legislative Services and Mr. Quist, the analyst, for what we consider a great job, and we agree completely with his recommendations.
Okay.
Having said that, I'm not going to sit here and read the testimony, but let me touch on a couple of top things, and then I'll try to address the questions that the vice chair and others have. First off, and I'm going to add a couple of comments as we go through this, if you don't mind.
Sure, go right ahead.
We started off talking about the impact of COVID-19, just to bring you up to date with where the Treasurer's Office is doing. And we are almost entirely remote at this point, other than folks who come in to do the IT, which allows us to be remote, and some of the banking that has to be done on site, banking investment that have to be done on site, but an amazing amount can be done remotely, at least in part thanks to the new IT system, which, as Mr. Quist pointed out, did take a little longer to come up, but will be fully up, I think, and Bernadette can correct me, by the end of the fiscal year. And is already making a tremendous difference in terms of both what the public can do, for instance, filing an insurance form, and working with the other agencies of state government. So it's been tough, but it really is making a difference. We note that the vacancy rate has been impacted by the pandemic. And I want to point this out, not just on behalf of the State Treasurer's Office, but concern with what I believe is our under-resourced state workforce already. There are a number of departments, not necessarily the Treasurer's Office, where I think we've seen such a great vacancy rate that it's impacting how the state can serve our constituents, and that's really a problem. And as you know, state work public service has a lot of attractions. Maryland State Public Service has a lot of attractions, but competitive salaries aren't usually among them. And this is getting to be a problem. It's a little break now because of the terrible unemployment situation at large. But as we hope the economy will come back strongly, and it seems to be going in that direction, we've got to look at managing state government. And if we want a significantly downsized personnel force, then you've got to figure out, I believe, what the government is not going to be doing. Because we can't sustain, they can't sustain, whether you're talking about the prisons, Treasurer's Office, or wherever. They're serious problems. And this is my opportunity to point them out to these august committees. In terms of our investments, I think Mr. Quist pointed out very well how we're doing in terms of the local government investment pool. I would point out that I believe a certain amount of that large sum is in fact COVID-related federal funding that is being placed in the local government investment pool as a good cash management practice. It does not argue in any way against the fact that the local governments, like the state, are facing tough budget situations, and they're not just secreting a bunch of money behind a tree, which unfortunately sometimes people believe. In terms of insurance, again, Bernadette can correct me, but I would have to say that in the abstract, looking at it, the overwhelming amount of insurance is in fact self-funded, because that's the entire state plant. And then we buy insurance, commercial insurance, to layer upon that for specific problems or issues, whether they're commercial or physical plant. And maybe Bernadette's got more numbers on that, but when you stand back and look at how the state insures itself, a great deal, overwhelming is indeed self-insurance. That does not argue against the fact that insurance rates are going up. And as we point out in our testimony, there are a number of reasons for them, that the insurance market is tightening altogether. But similar to the problems with the workforce, when you have buildings that are not maintained as well as they could be, they become expensive. When you have physical systems, plant systems that are not maintained as well as they could be, that becomes expensive. And this is a problem, very well with school construction,
Right.
but it's true also with the state's buildings and systems. Immediate cost savings by cutting maintenance, which is an old tradition, didn't just start, does cost in the end. The other thing about insurance is, I believe, though I'm not sure I can give you a list of places, that we are beginning to see the impact of the need to invest in resiliency and mitigation of climate change impacts. And that's going to impact many areas of the state, but we can see it as along the shore. Anne Arundel County, Queen Anne and Charles is dealing with that right now. So that's, insurance is becoming a point of reference throughout the country in terms of industries that are reacting first to climate change. In terms of the banking services, I will say that, yes, we are concerned about Wells Fargo. We were concerned about Bank of America and the other big banks also. The move has been going well. I mean, Wells Fargo, the group that deals with these state contracts, have been serving our agencies well, but that does not mean that we should let up or not be, in fact, more aggressive in terms of community development and making sure that Wells and all of our partners, in fact, act appropriately and contribute to equity and inclusion. That's part of our mission, and one that we take very seriously. So with that, that's a really fast summary of where we are, Mr. Chairman, Chairman, members.
All right. Thank you very much, Treasurer Kopp. Always good to see you. I want to open it up for any questions from the House Subcommittee on Public Safety and Administration. I don't see any at this time. Mr. Chairman Zucker, I will now yield back to you and to see whether there are any questions from the Senate side, and also to proceed to the next agency hearing. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Madam Treasurer. Good to see you. I think you normally stick around for the next one too. You're welcome. You're welcome to stick around. So we'll move on now to the Board of Public Works, starting out with Mr. Frank. Welcome.
Okay, hello. I am trying to share my screen. Does everyone see it?
We now see it. You're good to go.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, this is the Board of Public Works budget, as the chair had said. We'll start with this first graph. All the funding is general funds for this agency, and you can see some increases in 21 and 22, and that has to do with some erroneous conviction grants. I will, there's some information about that later on in the exhibit, and I'll provide more details about that. In this budget, there are three deficiencies, $630,000. This has to do with the judgments against the state for the erroneous convictions. The Board of Public Works has awarded some grants, and these funds are needed in order to pay those awards. There's also some money for the Baltimore Zoo. And that's discussed more in the key observation, and also the contingent fund. And as part of the money for these erroneous conviction grants came out of the contingent fund, so that's being replenished as well. There was some cost containment in 2020. And basically what happened is the three grants that the state gives to the Historic Annapolis Foundation, Western Maryland Scenic Railroad, and the Maryland Zoo in Baltimore were cut 10%. And let's see, a good example of how the agency spends its money is on this pie chart. You should be seeing a pie chart now. Okay, good. And about half of the money goes to the grants to nonprofits. Those are the three I just mentioned. A third of the money goes to the judgment against the state. Those are the erroneous conviction grants. My observation are going to focus on those two areas. And some budget changes are here. Most of the changes are with respect to the grants this year. That is and the erroneous conviction ones. And there were also some of the regular salary actions were taken. Now, going to the zoo next, the attendance trends. And this chart here you should be seeing is Exhibit 3. The blue line that you see is the long-term trend before the COVID pandemic. And generally the trend was upward. 2017 was an especially good year. There was good weather. There's some animal births and things like that. Weather was less good in the following years, but generally the trend has been upwards. As you might imagine, 2020 is down, and that has to do with COVID. And there's more information about that later in the analysis. Also, when it comes to spending, as you can see, a lot of the spending is grants and contributions that the zoo gets, and also there are some good sizable amount of attendance revenues. Here's a list that shows what the different grants are. The state of Maryland, its operating and capital budget grants provides almost $10 million for the zoo. And there are some other in the Baltimore City and the State Department of Education that also provide grants. This year, the zoo had to close down for almost 3 months. And what you see on this chart here is how quarterly attendance is. The big quarter, I should say, is the spring. And that's when the zoo was closed for most of it. The third quarter, which is the summer, that's July, August, and September, is generally a pretty good month as well. And what you can see is how far the average monthly attendance dropped from 2019 to 2020 with the pandemic. The good news is that the attendance has bounced back quite well since the reopening. And also good news is that membership tends to be doing very well. Also, if we look at the revenues and losses from over the last 6 years, you can see once again the effect of the pandemic. Most of it is, as you might expect, is affected by the visitor revenues because it was closed for a good part of 2020. But like the membership dues, that's held up very well. Now, in response to this pandemic, Zoo did 3 things. There were cost reductions, positions, the people were laid off, as happened in many other places. Also, the Paycheck Protection Program provided the zoo with some money, and it looks like this will be a grant, and not alone they will be able to, they used it in the way that means they don't have to pay it back. And there was some short-term borrowing also in 2020 that was paid back in 2021, which may create some pressures in the 2021 budget. So the kind of big questions for the zoo is rebuilding attendance, maintaining costs, and the short-term borrowing that I just mentioned, and Zoo should be able to discuss these issues and respond to questions that the committees have. The final observation I'm going to have has to do with the erroneous conviction grants. What happens here is if an individual is convicted erroneously, if they get either a pardon from the governor or a state's attorney certifies that they were erroneously convicted, they can petition the Board of Public Works for grants. In 2020, there were 10 grants were awarded in that fiscal year. 2 of the grants were for senior citizens, and they were 3-year grants, and the other 8 grants were 7-year grants for individuals. And that's why the numbers are quite a bit higher in 2021 and 2022. I also would like to point out that there is an item in the BRFA which changes the way these grants work moving forward. This will not have any effect on these 10 grants, but beginning in 2021, any grants that are awarded would be a 50-50 sharing between the state and a local government. Currently, the state funds 100% of of the grants. I want to make you aware of that. And finally, our recommendation is the annual budget bill language, which requires the zoo to provide us with audited financial statements and monthly attendance reports. And that concludes my presentation. I'm ready for questions.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Frank, for that thoughtful and thorough analysis. I don't see any questions right now from either subcommittee unless Chairman Haynes, do you see anyone on your side that I may have missed?
No, I don't see anyone. However, I do have a question. I think the Vice Chair has a question as well. So let me just ask a quick question of our analysts, and then I would call on our Vice Chair, Proctor, to ask a question, if that's okay with you, Mr. Chairman.
Of course.
Yeah. Patrick, I'm fairly familiar with how the budget reconciliation process works, but just there's an issue which I'm sort of concerned about that creates a bifurcated process as far as the grants are concerned for erroneously convicted individuals. And it's sort of that it creates that bifurcation can be somewhat prohibitive. My question is this: if the BRFA action is rejected by the committees, then the current process would continue. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Vice Chair Proctor. Vice Chair Proctor.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much. My question is along those same lines, and I guess I just need more understanding. But the folks that are eligible for this grant, I think that making a one-stop at the Board of Public Works is understandable, but hopefully this is not going to make them have to go between agencies trying to get the grants that they are due, which is another issue on top of what they've just suffered. So I really would have more discussion about that.
And I know Mr. Gontram, who's really been a great secretary for the Maryland Board of Public Works, will be up next. So Vice Chair, we'll also have him address that as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Are there any other questions? I don't see any from either subcommittee, so I will turn it on and over to Mr. John Gontram with the Board of Public Works and the Treasurer, Nancy Kopp. Welcome, Mr. Gontram.
Thank you, Chairman Zucker, Chairman Haynes, members of the committees. John Gontram, Executive Secretary of the Board of Public Works. Very happy to be with you again. I want to start by thanking Mr. Frank for such a thoughtful and meticulous analysis of this year's budget. As noted in his analysis, 89% of this year's proposed budget can be thought of as pass-through funding. This includes grants to the board's 3 perennial grantees, the Maryland Zoo in Baltimore, the Historic Annapolis Foundation, and the Western Maryland Scenic Railroad. These pass-through funds also include the board's contingent fund and, as was just discussed, funding to erroneously incarcerated individuals under State Finance Procurement 10501. As covered in Mr. Frank's analysis, as he just provided, in FY22, there are $4.1 million in payments to individuals erroneously incarcerated under State Finance Procurement 10501. For a larger perspective, to put some numbers to the chart he was just showing, since October 2019, as he said, the board has granted compensation under 10501 to 10 individuals, totaling just over $22 million to be paid out through fiscal year 2026. There are currently no petitions pending before the board that are eligible for compensation. We do have individuals from the Western Maryland Scenic Railroad, the Historic Annapolis Foundation, the Maryland Zoo in Baltimore, prepared to discuss their grants. I'll stop there, Mr. Chairman. I am happy to discuss the BRFA language if there's a specific question I can be helpful with.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, can I just jump? Okay. I think, first of all, it's good to see you, Mr. Secretary. Good to see you again.
Good to see you, Mr. Chair.
And hope you're staying safe in between COVID-19 and the freezing weather we're having outside. So between those two, I hope you're staying safe. Just have a quick question, and you probably have heard this thing sort of resonating between the subcommittee, the House subcommittee, and as it relates to changing the process for erroneously convicted individuals. My question sort of hinges on the proposed reconciliation process or BRFA item would seek to straddle that those grants equally between the locals and the state. And I think the big issue is not so much on relief from the state perspective on those grants as it is of having an erroneously convicted individual having to navigate between the two levels of government. And my concern is what happens if you play this out hypothetically, if an individual is filing a claim at the state level and is also filing a claim at the local level, what happens if either one of those two levels, the board or the locals, reject the claim? What happens? And so my question is, so that we're consistent, is can we get there? Is it possible to get there a different way, whereas the erroneously convicted individual would still petition to the Board of Public Works, but then the locals can petition the board for reimbursement or I mean, I would say that let the locals deal with the Board of Public Works on that reimbursement from the locals, so 50%. The burden seems to be prohibited by no fault of the convicted's part to navigate between the two. And so my question really centers around, do the one stop at the Board of Public Works and then either let the Board of Public Works recoup that 50% from the locals, or the locals, on their own initiative, provide that 50% payment to the state? Can you play that out for me in some fashion?
Mr. Chairman, I can certainly do my best, and I just want to start by thanking you for your well wishes and saying I certainly hope you and all of the committee's members on the two committees are well and safe in these troubling times. And I want to personally thank you for your service to the state of Maryland as citizen legislators during these unprecedented circumstances. We do have the treasurer, and Madam Treasurer, I know you're here, and thank you again for joining me this year. And please don't hesitate to cut me off or to revise or append to my remarks as necessary. A couple observations about the BRFA language that hopefully will provide some help in thinking about this. I think we can just talk maybe some background about how it works right now and how the BRFA language might alter it. So right now, 10501 is structured as a compensatory grant program where there is no prior, there's no, and the BRFA language includes the word settlement. The word settlement is not included under 10501 currently, but the BRFA language says this is a settlement. So the question is, what does injecting the word settlement into the 10501 framework mean? Are they saying that this is going to preclude future actions by the petitioners against either the state or presumably the local jurisdiction? In many of the underlying circumstances we have now, there's almost certainly no cause of action potentially against the state in the future. These are not actions by either state judges or state police officers. It's purely a compensatory grant payment program on the behalf of the state that the General Assembly set up to provide these individuals with some measure of justice and recompense given the circumstances. Now, as a matter of practice, the Board of Public Works, when an individual qualifies under 10501 and is eligible and they're going to receive grant funding, does have the individual sign a grant agreement. The primary purpose of this grant agreement is to make sure that the individual confirms that they are accepting the grant as full satisfaction of what they're due under 10501. 10501 doesn't have a specific amount in it. It says that the board may award an amount commensurate with actual damages to these individuals. So the purpose of the grant agreement is for the individual to sign saying that, yes, this is commensurate with my actual damages. In other words, to put it bluntly, they're not going to return to the Board of Public Works seeking additional funding under 10501. Now, there's a secondary benefit to the state, which is the grant agreement provides that the claimants agree, the petitioners, I should say, agree to release any potential future claims against the state. Now, explicitly, the grant agreements, most recent grant agreements do not provide such releases at the local level. Frankly, in talking to counsel representing petitioners, the three most discussed topics are the amount of the compensation, the schedule of grant payments, and thirdly, whether they're going to preserve the ability to have a right of action against the local jurisdiction, normally a federal civil rights claim. Injecting the word settlement into this program could potentially cause some hurdles. How it would play out in practice, Mr. Chairman, and I hope that background was helpful, because my ultimate answer is I'm not quite sure how this would play out in practice. If the grant agreement must also preclude action against the locals, it could be that the petitioners will not want to sign the grant agreement, which could cause complications at the Board of Public Works. It is a discretionary grant program where the board may award this compensation, but it's certainly not obligated to under the current statutory framework. It could be, as you said, alluded to, Mr. Chairman, where the board approves its portion of the grant funding, it's 50%, and then the petitioners are left to seek the remaining 50% from the county. I can play out a few more alternate scenarios if you want, Mr. Chair, all which would have complications for how we administratively would go about obtaining the requisite signatures on the grant agreement. But ultimately, I'm not sure what the actual practice would be.
I think you have buttressed my concern because they're depending upon, when I look at it, depending upon various scenarios, and I just sort of threw that one out to you. I can see down the road some complications with it, and so I think it's a little bit more complicated than what it appears on the face of the item itself, and when you play out various scenarios. So it might be something we need to look at a little closer. I'll put it that way. But I don't want to hold the hearing up with, thank you so much. I don't want to hold the hearing up any further on this particular issue. So I will turn it over to, I think Vice Chair Proctor had a question.
Could I just intervene to say, and I'm sorry, John, but there have been few people who have been as involved and as important in all these discussions as John Gontram.
Right.
And I really urge, if you go forward with this, that you bring John into the conversation, because he has lived this for the last, I don't know how long. This is a very serious situation. The term erroneous conviction or erroneous incarceration is so antiseptic.
Right.
I, as John knows, hate to use it, but we've put people in prison for a long time for absolutely the wrong reasons. And what I hope you will look to is not only to make it simple and fair and just, but also to make sure that the people who perpetrated this, or the institutions that perpetrated it, have no incentive whatsoever to do it again.
Okay. Duly noted,
And
Treasurer.
I guess that would be, so that would be done by rejecting the Burfa language. But have you all taken a formal position on the Budget Reconciliation Financing Act recommendation
No,
on this particular?
actually,
Okay.
I didn't know about, no.
Okay.
Mr.
Gontram,
Chairman?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure
Yes.
whether Vice Chair Proctor had a question at this point or not?
I didn't know. No, I don't
Okay.
have a question.
All right.
The real,
Thank you.
as I mentioned, the real issue is to prevent it in the first place. And of course, there's no amount of money that's going to be enough to cover the loss and suffering of these folks. So we certainly don't want to complicate it with kind of projected suggestion that we're hearing now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Zucker.
Mr. Gontram? Yeah, of course. Thank you for that, for the questions. And Mr. Gontram, is there anything else you want to add or anything else before we open it up to further questions, and then we can move on to the next panel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Madam Treasurer, was there anything else that you wanted to add? I know that you're a member of the Board of Public Works. Is there anything else you wanted to add before we open it up again to questions and then move on to the next panel?
No, Mr. Chairman, other than the fact that we're all here to answer the question and be of assistance.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I don't see any other questions. Unless Chairman Haynes, I'm missing something, we can move on to the Maryland Zoo in Baltimore. Mr. Kirby Fowler, the new president and CEO, and Diane Hutchins. Welcome, Mr. Fowler. And I know that in the budget analysis, there were specific questions regarding the Maryland Zoo. So if we have your written testimony, welcome. So if you could just hit the highlights and respond to the analysis, it would be appreciated. Mr. Fowler.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. And hello, Chairman Haynes. It's nice to see you again.
Good to see you. Good to see you.
As you mentioned, I'm here with Diane Hutchins, our Vice President of Government Relations, and she's worked very closely with Patrick Frank. And we want to thank Patrick for all his assistance and thorough analysis, as well as the Executive Secretary, John Gontram. I think you've been on the job 6 months longer than I have, but it sounds like you already had it well under control. So I did start on July 1st of 2020, and of course, it was not a great time to start at the zoo. Within 2 months, we cut our workforce by 22%. So it's really tough cutting of expenses, but we have been able to rebound thanks to our open environment, but also our practices to increase attendance and increase revenue. We are beating the 3-year average for attendance right now, believe it or not, which is phenomenal. And we hope to see that continue as we move forward. We are looking into a master plan that would cover the next 5 to 10 years with a major goal of increasing attendance at our zoo. I'm very excited to see at least the trends and the excitement that people are showing support for the zoo. With regard to the costs, the question about cost containment, because of the major cuts we undertook in July and August, we are well positioned when things get back to normal to address some really important issues at the zoo, mostly related to compensation. I was one of the first people at my prior job at Downtown Partnership to increase the minimum wage to $15 per person. And I'd like to get that quickly happening at the zoo. We are making progress towards that goal, significant progress, but I would like to move forward quickly. Of course, we cannot use, we have not been successful in raising private sector funds to achieve that. So we need the public sector support to do so. So thank you for your support in that regard. And with regard to borrowing, the question about borrowing, we hope not to do that again. We do not expect to do that again because our numbers are looking strong now. And also we've had the federal, state, and the local jurisdiction assistance. So we do not intend to borrow again this year, and I hope never again while I'm at the zoo. So those are the major questions that are presented to us. Of course, we appreciate the support of the state over and over again and agree with the assessment of Patrick Frank and the board. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions for Mr. Fowler? I do not see any questions. Chairman Haynes, do you see any on your end? I don't see any on either subcommittee, but I don't know if anyone. We've got one for you that's raising their hand. So if you want to call on Delegate Astor Barrow.
Let me see here, Delegate. Mr. Chairman, I actually do not see that hand raised, but
I would remind delegates and senators to please use the raise hand feature under the reactions tab. And now there is a question. So, Mr. Chairman, over to you to recognize your delegate.
Sure. Delegate Acevedo, go right ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Fowler. I just wanted to come back to to what you said in your remarks about getting $15 an hour. When do you expect to get to 15 an hour?
Sure. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Is that?
No, that's it. That's it.
Okay,
Just,
great,
you know,
great.
I'm glad that the zoo is heading in that direction. You know, but we want to ensure that, you know, as much as it is an attraction for everyone in our state and across the country, that the folks that are working there that make the zoo what it is are able to also make ends meet. So I appreciate the fact that you all are heading in that direction. I'd appreciate a little bit more specificity as how long. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for your question. I'm still trying to wrap my head around all the numbers, but I believe last year, 84 people were below the employees were below the $15 an hour wage. Now it's down to 37. So my goal, assuming attendance remains strong and assuming that we receive additional federal assistance, hopefully under the new PPP dollars, that we'll be in good shape to, I would like within this year to get everybody above $15. And hopefully by the summer, I will know for certain whether we could do that. But we did cut so deeply. My own assessment is at $1.6 million we cut in expenses and reduced revenue last year, that if things do turn around, which it looks like things are going to be more positive, we'll have the funds to be able to achieve that and hopefully more this year.
Thank you, Mr. Fowler. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're quite
Thank you
welcome.
very much. Thank you. Are there any other questions? I don't see any. We will now move on to the Historic Annapolis Foundation. Mr. Robert Clark, welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Joint Chairman and members of the subcommittees. Historic Annapolis, if you don't know, is the leading nonprofit history and preservation organization for the city. As you may know, we manage 12 historic properties, 11 of which are owned by the state of Maryland. Our mission is to preserve and protect these historic treasures, along with the historic character of Annapolis, so we can share them with the public through interpretation and meaningful experiences. We are in the budget for FY22 at an amount of $710,000, which is the same amount we received last year, but 10% less than we received the 4 previous years. We understand cuts were made across the board for necessary reasons, and we remain grateful for the state's funding. It is, however, our strong desire to have the grant restored back to $789,000, the amount next fiscal year. Our organization relies on the BPW grant to fund about 1/3 of our general operating budget, specifically critical staff positions, maintenance, interpretation of the 11 state-owned properties under our care. During a typical year, we raise the remaining 2/3 of earned income from earned income and contributions, but with COVID-19 revenues are down about 25% and receiving state funding has become more critical than ever. We're doing everything we can in our power to adjust operating costs and raise as much revenue as possible, and urge the committee to consider restoring our grant to the full $789,000 next fiscal year. We remain grateful for past support, and we're pleased to receive support again this fiscal year. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Well, thank you very much. And you've got a great state senator that represents the great city of Annapolis. So I know that she's continued to do everything that she can to deliver for the city and the constituents that she represents. Are there any questions for Mr. Clark? I do not see any from either subcommittee. Mr. Chairman Haynes, do you see anyone on your side that I may miss, or give me questions?
No, I think you've covered it all, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, well, thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you.
Clark. We will now move. You're welcome. We'll now move on to Mr. John Garner, Executive Director of the Western Maryland Scenic Railroad. Welcome. And just make sure you unmute yourself.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. You're on. Go ahead.
I'm actually here with Mayor Flanagan of Frostburg, who's also on our board, and Mayor will be offering up some remarks for us.
Great. Go ahead, Mr. Mayor. Good to see you.
Good to see you all. Good afternoon. Greetings from snowy, white, wonderful Western Maryland. We've got about a foot of God's graciousness here to play with right now. So if you'd like to go skiing this weekend, the Wisp is open. Come on up. I'd like to thank you all for your time. I mentioned the Wisp. The Wisp is like ourselves. We're a tourist attraction. We're an entertainment draw to the western part of the state. We are the operator of an actual steam-powered railroad in the great state of Maryland, and we're very proud of that. Just quick to capsulize where we are right now. We came out of the 2019 operating season with one of the greatest Christmas programs we've ever done, and attracted almost 12,000 people to Western Maryland in the course of just 5 weekends. 2020 dawned and darkness fell over the tourist industry, as everyone knows. We've had to make a number of adjustments to stay somewhat operational. By that, I mean using the BPW money and some other things to keep us in the maintenance mode so that we can do a relaunch, hopefully late spring, early summer this year, as again, people get vaccinated, et cetera. We have to do most of our entertaining indoors in very tight spaces on passenger cars. So we don't have the advantage that the zoo has, that they can have people outside. But once again, I'd like to thank you all for your support over the years, and we look forward to seeing you in wild and wonderful Western Maryland this summer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Garner, was there anything you wanted to add, or is that sounds like it's pretty good covering it, but I didn't know if there's anything else you wanted to add.
Yes, I think the good mayor has shared our thoughts. We want to thank you for the continued support from the last several years and look forward to a bright, shining future here in the state of Maryland.
Thank you very much. Open it up now to questions. Is there any questions for any of these panels from either subcommittee? I don't see any. I don't see any. Chairman Haynes, is there any last thoughts you have before we adjourn?
Well, I would just say that from the House perspective, and in particular the subcommittee, PSA, we had an opportunity to come out a year or so ago and do a site visit to Western Maryland, including Frostburg State University and the Scenic Railroad, Maryland Scenic Railroad. It is very enlightening. And also want to let you know that you are well represented on this subcommittee and on the full committee by your representative out there from Western Maryland, Delegate McKay. And so he's our go-to person whenever we need some information as it relates to the railroad and Western Maryland. So he's doing a great job for you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate his help.
Well, on that note, I don't see anything else or any other comments or any other questions. So with that, that adjourns our budget hearings today. Thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.
Okay. Thank you.